Hello friends. Example of dutifulness can be seen not only in India but across many countries around the world. Like Chief Joseph George Washington. And today we will introduce you to a great personality like George Washington, who has set a different level of dutifulness. Everyone thinks of their own good, but to think for others' good and to fight for it is the highest example of dutifulness for the human race. In every religion, humanity is regarded as the highest virtue. If we are born as a human being in this world, then our first duty is to protect humans and humanity as a whole. The story that I'm going to tell you today, that story actually started in the year 1732 in Virginia in USA with the birth of a baby named George in a very prosperous family. This was actually the time when the American colonies were ruled by the British, and the Britishers kept on having fights with their neighboring country France regularly. In such a scenario, unwillingly though, the Americans had to keep fighting for the Britishers against the strong forces of France. Like any other children, George too wanted to fight against the French forces. However, George did not have a strong inclination towards studies. Most of his time was spent in his farms, fields, and the gardens. Because in those days, the children of prosperous families would have private tutors. Everything was going good. George was almost 11 years old when all of a sudden his father passed away, leaving him all alone. Nothing could pacify the pain of losing a father, but still, George regarded himself to be very lucky because his own elder brother never let him feel the absence of his father. George always spent his time in doing something or the other. Although he never went to a college, but whenever he could, George would always help his mother. George loved to do plantation in his own garden. George was looking for some good work for himself, and at the age of 16, he got the job of a surveyor. At his work, while doing the measurements of the land, his love for his motherland also kept increasing gradually. And that's the reason why George soon left his job and got enrolled in the American Army. And George, almost at the age of 20, got the position of major in the army. While working in British Army, George participated in the war against France. Although his army had lost the fight, but after the defeat, will to win the fight never allowed the war to come to an end. That's why even after the defeat with France, the war kept on going for a long time. George was fond of writing letters. He would often write his heart out in those letters. It is said that in his lifetime, George had written almost 18 to 20,000 letters. After this, almost at the age of 26, George was selected as the representative of Virginia. In the meantime, the war with the French army was still going on, and George, with his men, kept fighting them one after the other. And almost at the age of 46 years, George was made the chief of Northern States Army. In his career span of 9 years as an army chief, he made it very difficult for the French army. However, if one had looked deep in his heart, he would realize that George was more tired than French army of this war and fights with the France. On the other hand, the Britishers, in order to recover the money wasted in wars, kept increasing the tax on the American colonies. That's why George wanted freedom for all the American colonies from the British rule by bringing them together. And for this dutifulness towards his land and his people, almost at the age of 57, George Washington was elected as the first president of America. George was actually the only president who was elected unanimously. Even after becoming the President of America, George used to travel to the southern states in his horse cart so that he can know more about his own country. After becoming the president, George did many great things, but his biggest contribution was that he made many accords amongst many other enemy countries of that time. Every country was fed up of the war and the poverty that was left behind after war. George then, with his dialogues, convinced the war-inclined countries and showed them the path of peace. George Washington, after becoming the President of America, dreamt of making America a powerful and developed country altogether. However, when George became the president, United States of America was a small country whereon 11 states were included with almost 4 million people. George did not have any rule book from where he could learn that how a president should handle the home and foreign matters wisely. George knew it well that the work he would do or every right and wrong decision that he would take would set an example for the coming presidents of the country. And keeping this in his mind, very carefully, George Washington took every decision. He also established the government of America based on the Constitution. To run the law and order smoothly in the country, George also established the Supreme Court. George Washington became the President of America twice. And after 2 consecutive rule as a president, George himself left the presidency. And it was his decision that no one can remain in the president's role more than twice in their lifetime. George took this decision because he did not want anyone can remain in this powerful position for a longer period of time. Because in that case, a person may misuse the power and become a dictator. Because of his dutifulness towards his countrymen, George Washington is also known as the Father of America, and it was in his name that the capital of America is kept as Washington, D.C. It is difficult to understand one's duty, and it is more difficult to continue doing that. But those who have strong determination, they continue doing their duty towards humanity till the last moment of their lives. By doing this, they also set a rule book for the coming generation, who can walk on those rules. And as per requirements, they can update it in their minds by understanding them and by altering them, and can become dutiful towards their own country. Thank you.
He wasn't an intellectual. He wasn't a great speaker or a brilliant writer. He wasn't, as a military leader, a brilliant tactician or a strategist. But he had the capacity to make people want to follow him. And if there was a more courageous human being who ever lived, I don't know who it was. And it was the courage of his convictions. And he would not quit. Every sign was, it was over, you've lost, give up, it's not worth it. but no, he wouldn't stop. And he was the same kind of a unifying force when he became president, maybe more so. You know, it didn't just come to us out of the sky. It just, these advantages we have, this system of life and government and our freedoms didn't just happen. Somebody had to work hard and suffer, and many of them, of course, died to make it happen. And the doubters were all around. It wasn't as if everybody was, oh, this is a wonderful thing, let's go out and fight for it. A fraction of the country was for it. A fraction of the country was willing to serve in the Army. I think maybe if there's a message in Washington's life, it's that willingness to serve and not just talk about what you're going to do, but to act. It takes both. And absolute selfless service to the country in, as they said, war and peace, for no pay, nothing in it for him. And then when he gets the ultimate power, as almost nobody could imagine, he gave it up, willingly, of his own choice. And this was after the war was over and he'd won. He was the conquering general, he was the hero. He could have been anything he wanted, czar, king, potentate, whatever. He could have made the presidency into a totally different kind of office. But he relinquished power. He said, no, I'm going back to Mount Vernon. And when George III heard that he, George Washington, might do that, he said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And because nobody had done that before. This was the ultimate ideal of Cincinnatus.